On social networks in recent days, a hot piece of information has emerged. Did Big Brother Russia give Vietnam a heads up about the fuel export ban starting April 1st out of nowhere, while European neighbors were lowering their voices to plead for Russian fuel imports, only to face a resolute door slam? Vietnam, at the very 90th minute before the ban was announced, signed a contract with Russia for oil and gas supply. This seems like a perfect solution to the domestic gasoline and energy price puzzle. The noteworthy point is these regulations are still regulations, and Russia still speaks of export restrictions, but they do not directly interfere with state-level agreements. This creates a grey area, not illegal, not a loophole, but clearly something that is not granted to everyone. An interesting point is that typically government, state, or national level trips must be announced a month in advance. For example, when General Secretary Talam visited the US, American media reported it 2 to 3 weeks prior, yet Prime Minister Pham Minh Chin's visit to Russia was only announced a few days before. Perhaps it was just a coincidence that Vietnam visited Russia at that time. So, when many ask whether Russia tipped off Vietnam beforehand, no one can likely provide a definitive answer. But one thing is quite clear: in a world where energy is being used as a bargaining chip, being half a step ahead is sometimes not just an advantage, it is a vital condition for ensuring national interests. Setting aside external stories, what is happening domestically alone shows that Vietnam is forced to recalibrate its approach to the energy narrative. In fact, without even discussing external affairs, looking at the domestic situation reveals that Vietnam is facing a significant challenge. Mainstay oil fields like Bac Ho are no longer in their prime. This isn't news, but it becomes clearer every year. A gradual decline in production is almost inevitable. Meanwhile, demand is moving in the opposite direction. As the economy grows, energy demand pulls upward, from manufacturing to daily life operations. These two trends are moving apart, and the gap in between must be filled. Importing is an inevitable choice, but the issue lies in the fact that the energy market is no longer purely commercial. It is pulled by all sorts of factors: geopolitics, transport routes, and disruption risks. There are times when it's not about buying cheap or expensive, but whether one can buy reliably. In that context, Russian oil is clearly an option worth considering. However, looking closely, one can see that turning an option into a solution is not simple. The first hurdle is technology. Refineries like Dang Quoc or Nghi Son are designed to optimize light oil with fewer impurities. Russian oil, however, has different characteristics. If introduced in large proportions without preparation, it might not yield optimal efficiency and could even drive up operating costs. In other words, a good price doesn't mean it's ready to use immediately. Then comes logistics. Long geographical distances and transport routes passing through sensitive areas result in higher costs and risks. When added up, the initial advantage could narrow significantly. Payment is another layer of the puzzle. With international financial channels restricted, transactions require more flexible mechanisms, which means risks must be controlled more rigorously. Overall, Vietnam's decision not to rush into a specific supply source is not a missed opportunity, but a calculated approach. Instead of solving a short-term problem, Vietnam is step-by-step expanding its adaptability, upgrading refineries to process diverse oil sources, seeking ways to diversify payments, and optimizing the transport chain. These steps do not produce immediate results, but in return, they help Vietnam avoid dependence on a single choice. And in a market where volatility can strike rapidly, holding multiple options in hand is sometimes the most important advantage. Looking at Vietnam-Russia oil and gas cooperation in recent years, it is hard not to ask, were there early signals that Vietnam managed to read, and further, were there one-step-ahead moves in approaching Russian energy sources, especially as the global market fluctuates wildly due to geopolitics? This question is not unfounded. Reality shows that oil and gas cooperation between the two countries is not a short-term relationship, but a structure that has operated stably for over 40 years, centered around the Vietsof-Petro joint venture, a model nearly unique in the history of the global oil and gas industry. From the discovery of oil at the Bac Ho field in the 1980s to maintaining an output of millions of tons per year today, this relationship has always been characterized by clear inheritance and continuity. This means Vietnam does not approach Russian oil and gas as a simple buy-sell transaction. Instead, Vietnam participates in the entire value chain, from exploration and production to field management and reinvesting back into Russia through projects like Rusvietpetro. Once inside that ecosystem, accessing resources is no longer a matter of pure market dynamics, but a long-term strategy. It is at this point that the early signal hypothesis becomes worth considering. Vietnam may not be the fastest responder in the media, but it is one of the parties that best understands the operational structure of the Russian oil and gas industry, from extraction techniques to state-owned enterprise cooperation mechanisms. Relationships with giants like Zarubezhneft, Gazprom, or Rosneft go beyond signatures. They have formed a substantive cooperation network over decades. However, the foreknowledge hypothesis alone is insufficient. The more noteworthy point lies in how Vietnam acts. There are no signs of a rush strategy to stockpile or buy aggressively when the market fluctuates. There are no loud proclamations about seizing cheap opportunities. Instead, steps still take place within existing cooperation frameworks, adjusted by intergovernmental agreements, joint venture extensions, and the controlled expansion of extraction areas. In other words, even if there were early signals, Vietnam did not turn them into short-term, opportunistic actions. Vietnam does not buy oil simply because it is cheap. It only accesses energy sources when the technical, legal, and partnership foundations are ready for efficient exploitation. This is a crucial distinction, because in the energy industry, especially oil and gas, the risk lies not in buying high or low, but in failing to control the subsequent value chain. An oil purchase contract can solve immediate needs, but a joint venture lasting decades is what determines national energy capacity. Vietnam, looking at the story with Russia, has clearly chosen the second path. This approach also explains why Vietnam-Russia cooperation has not fractured even as the international context changed. After the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia inherited all commitments, and the joint ventures continue to operate stably. This shows that the cooperation structure does not depend entirely on short-term political shifts, but is built on long-term interests and technical trust. Looking more broadly, Russia is just one piece of Vietnam's energy puzzle. Oil and gas relations with Russia, while symbolic and historically deep, are still only part of a strategy to diversify energy sources and partners. What is noteworthy is that Vietnam does not box in its cooperation with Russia within traditional oil and gas. In recent years, both sides have begun expanding into new energy sectors such as natural gas, offshore wind power, and even nuclear energy. This trend shows that Vietnam is not just utilizing an old legacy of cooperation, but is seeking to redefine it within the context of the global energy transition. Conversely, Vietnam is not entirely dependent on Russia. The fact that major Russian oil and gas corporations operate alongside many international partners in Vietnam and that PetroVietnam invests abroad demonstrates an open and flexible structure. Vietnam cooperates deeply while maintaining the necessary distance to ensure a balance of interests. It is this balance that creates a notable characteristic in how Vietnam plays in the energy sector, not choosing sides absolutely, but choosing interests calculatively. Here, a sense of maturity is evident. If in the 1980s, Vietnam needed the Soviet Union as a pillar to build its oil and gas industry from nearly zero, lacking capital, technology, and human resources, today, Vietnam has enough capacity to participate in international projects as a more equal partner. That shift has not been loud, but it is very clear. From being helped, Vietnam has gradually moved toward working together. From being technologically dependent, Vietnam has mastered many technical stages and even contributed back to joint projects. That is why, when looking at Vietnam-Russia oil and gas relations today, one should not see it merely as a bilateral cooperation story. It reflects how Vietnam positions itself in a restructuring global energy system. Russia, in that picture, is not the sole center, but it is a partner deep enough for Vietnam to learn from, experiment with, and consolidate its capacity. And perhaps the most important point lies not in contracts or production figures, but in how Vietnam controls its own pace. Not chasing the market, yet not staying out of the game. Not reacting too fast, but not missing the opportunity.